Hey everyone, it's Helen Castillo here with moodfabrics.com, and today we're going to be doing French seams. So I'm working on the Onella blouse right now in a polyester chiffon, which is no joke. So first things first, you've got two center front panels, which are here. You can see I've got a bust dart sewn in place already. And when you press a bust dart, you want to be sure that the excess is pointing down toward the hem. So one other thing I'd like to point out is if you have a scrap of some pattern paper, it's highly advised that when you are sewing any type of lightweight fabric, you place a piece of scrap pattern paper underneath while sewing. And what that creates is a perforated line that you can just tear away the paper after you've sewn any seams. Be sure to change your tension before you start sewing your project, and use a scrap piece of fabric to test the machine settings. We have our sleeves, and these are fairly traditional of a set-in sleeve, but there are two notches in place on the shoulder or the cap where you're going to want to do a running stitch and gather that up before you set it into your armholes. Along the bottom edge of my sleeve here, which I'm going to set into my cuffs. What I'm going to do for this Onella blouse is I'm going to do what are called French seams. And French seams are going to eliminate the need for doing any sort of clean finishing on the inside of the garment. So for my first French seam, what I'm going to do is I'm going to attach the front of my bodice or my two front panels to my back. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to place my fabric with wrong sides together, and then I'm going to sew my seam allowances at 1/8 of an inch. And what that's going to do is it's going to keep your seam allowances on the outside of the garment so that we can flip it to be right sides together and sew the remainder of that seam allowance 3/8 of an inch. All right, so I've got that 1/8 of an inch side seam sewn in place with my wrong sides of the fabric, or the back side of the fabric, facing each other. I'm going to go in and I'm going to trim this to reduce the amount of seam allowance that I have in the excess away from my stitch line, so that when I flip this to do the 3/8, none of that, if by accident, gets caught up or becomes too bulky in my finished French seam allowance. So because this chiffon is so lightweight, I'm super lucky I don't have to press it necessarily, but what you can do is you can lay that nice and flat on your ironing board and press it toward the back. Press the seam allowance toward the back. Now once that's pressed, I'm going to flip my entire garment so that it has right sides together. And what the French seam is going to do is catch that seam allowance within itself so that the garment looks clean on the inside with no need for serging or bias bound of the seam allowance. So I'm just going to kind of roll my seam allowance, press again, and it'll kind of serve as a template for when I go in the machine to sew the remaining 3/8 of an inch. So now I'm going to run back to the machine and I'm going to finish up the full 1/2 inch seam allowance with the remaining 3/8 of an inch. And that 3/8 will be with my right sides of the garment together. All right, so to finish up that French seam, what you can do is you can place silk pins for lighter weight fabrics to keep that seam allowance nice and flat. And the silk pins are lighter weight, so it's less likely to leave any indentations or damage in your fabric. I personally prefer not to place the pins, but it takes some practice. Clip your thread, and that is your finished French seam. You can see how the first 1/8 that I sewed earlier is kind of like trapped inside there. So from the inside of the garment, you've got this nice clean casing for your seam allowance. And from the right side of your garment, you have a super clean seam. Very delicate. It works best, especially with lightweight fabric, so you don't have to go in and clean finish that seam allowance with a serge or a zigzag, however you prefer. And that is a French seam.